They walked right past him like he didn't exist. After everything he sacrificed, every dollar, every sleepless night, every dream he buried for them, his own children looked him in the eye and called him something no father should ever hear. Not dad, not even his name, but something far worse. And in that moment, standing alone in a crowded airport, he realized sending them away might have been the biggest mistake of his life. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. His name was Daniel Harper, a man most people would pass on the street without a second glance, the kind of man whose story doesn't make headlines, but should. He wasn't famous, he wasn't wealthy, and he never expected applause for the life he lived. But for nearly 2 decades, he carried a responsibility that would have broken most men, raising 3 children alone in a small Midwestern town after their mother disappeared without explanation just weeks before they were born. No note, no warning, just silence that stretched into years, leaving Daniel to step into a role he had never prepared for, becoming both father and mother overnight. Daniel worked wherever he could find a paycheck, starting as a mechanic in a run-down auto shop, then picking up night shifts at a warehouse, and sometimes even cleaning office buildings after midnight just to make sure there was food on the table in the morning. He learned how to braid his daughter's hair by watching videos late at night, rewinding over and over until his hands got it right, and he learned how to quiet the cries of 3 infants at once by instinct rather than instruction, holding one in each arm while rocking the third with his foot. The house was never quiet, never easy, but it was filled with something he believed mattered more than comfort: effort. He made a promise to himself early on that his children would never feel the absence that defined his own childhood, and every decision he made traced back to that promise, even when it cost him everything else. The triplets grew into 3 distinct personalities, each carrying a different reflection of the life they were raised in. Ethan, the oldest by minutes, carried ambition like armor, always chasing something bigger, something beyond the limits of the town they lived in. Lucas, quieter but sharper, observed more than he spoke, often questioning things Daniel didn't have the answers to. And then there was Lily, the youngest, who held onto warmth longer than the others, the one who still reached for her father's hand even as the years tried to pull her away. Daniel watched them grow with a mix of pride and fear, knowing that the closer they got to adulthood, the further they might drift from the life he could provide. He pushed them toward education with a determination that sometimes felt like pressure, repeating the same words at the dinner table night after night, that education was their way out, their way forward, their way to a life he could never give them himself. By the time they reached their late teens, the gap between Daniel's world and theirs had already begun to show. They spoke about cities he had never visited, careers he barely understood, and opportunities that seemed just out of reach until one letter changed everything. It arrived on an ordinary afternoon, thin envelopes that carried the weight of something extraordinary, partial scholarships to study overseas at institutions that promised futures far beyond anything their hometown could offer. Daniel read those letters over and over, pride swelling in his chest, but beneath it was something heavier, the quiet realization that this opportunity came with a price he wasn't sure he could afford. The scholarships covered tuition, but not travel, not living expenses, not the countless unseen costs that came with sending 3 young adults across the world. Most people would have hesitated, would have questioned whether it was worth risking everything for a chance that wasn't guaranteed, but Daniel never saw it that way. To him, this wasn't a gamble, it was a responsibility, the final step in a journey he had already given his life to. He sold his truck, the one thing he owned outright, and took out loans he knew would follow him for years. He cut back on everything: meals, sleep, even heat during the colder months, convincing himself that discomfort was temporary but opportunity was not. The day he bought their plane tickets, he sat alone at the kitchen table long after they had gone to bed, staring at the receipt like it was both a victory and a farewell. He didn't tell them how much it cost him, not in money, not in effort, and certainly not in fear. In the morning they left, at the airport, the weight of the decision finally settled into something real. The tickets were no longer just numbers on paper. They were a one-way movement into a life David could not follow. He stood with them in that crowded space, surrounded by strangers and stories that had nothing to do with his own. Yet for him, everything felt personal, every second carrying the awareness that this was the moment his role would shift in ways he couldn't fully control. He hugged each of them, holding on just long enough to feel the presence he had fought so hard to protect. There were words he could have said, warnings, reminders, even requests, but he chose something simpler, telling them to take care of themselves, to stay focused, to remember where they came from. It wasn't a speech, it was a hope, one that he trusted would stay with them long after they walked away. As they disappeared beyond the gate, David remained where he was, watching until there was nothing left to see. The noise of the airport returned around him, people moving, announcements echoing, life continuing as if nothing had changed. But for him, everything had. The house would be quieter, the routine different, the purpose less immediate but no less important. He told himself that this was success, that this was what all those years had been leading to, even as the emptiness began to settle in. He didn't know what the future would look like, how much would change, or how much would stay the same. All he knew was that he had done what he believed was right, given everything he had to give, and now, all that was left was to wait and see what it would mean when they came back. Time has a way of moving forward without asking who it leaves behind, and for David Carter, the years that followed were measured less by calendars and more by absence. The house that once carried the noise of 3 growing children became quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar at first, then permanent. Mornings no longer began with urgency, no rushed breakfasts, no overlapping conversations, just silence broken only by routine. David adapted the way he always had. By continuing to work, by filling his days with purpose even when the reason behind it had shifted. The loans he took to send Ethan, Lucas, and Lily abroad didn't disappear with distance. They stayed, growing heavier with time, and he carried them without complaint, the same way he had carried everything else. While David's world remained grounded in repetition, theirs expanded in ways he could only imagine through brief conversations and occasional updates. Ethan moved quickly through his field, finding opportunities that placed him in environments far removed from where he started, surrounded by people who spoke in terms of growth, investment, and ambition. Lucas followed a path that was quieter but just as successful, building a career that gave him stability and recognition, the kind that came with respect from people who had never known the life he came from. Lily found her place in a world that valued presence and image, adapting in ways that allowed her to belong, even if it meant leaving parts of her past behind. Their lives became filled with things David had never experienced: travel, connections, comfort, and a sense of forward movement that never slowed down. The contrast between their lives and his didn't happen all at once. It grew gradually, in small details that became harder to ignore over time. Phone calls shifted from conversations to updates, short, efficient, focused on achievements rather than feelings. When they spoke about their lives, it was with a tone that suggested distance, not just in location but in understanding. David listened carefully, always proud, always supportive, even when the words felt unfamiliar. He didn't interrupt, didn't question, didn't remind them of what it took to get there, because in his mind, their success was the outcome he had worked for. If they were moving forward, then he had done his part. Back home, his own life began to narrow. The house became too much to maintain, both financially and emotionally, and eventually he let it go, moving into a smaller apartment that held only what he needed and little else. The walls were bare compared to what they once were, fewer reminders, fewer traces of the life that had filled those spaces. His work slowed as his body began to feel the years of strain he had pushed through without rest. The long shifts became harder to manage, the physical demands less forgiving, but he adjusted as best he could, taking on what he was able, never fully stepping away because stopping meant facing the silence more directly. Loneliness didn't arrive as a sudden feeling. It settled in gradually, becoming part of the background of his days. Meals were quieter, evenings longer, and the small habits he had built around his children, checking in, preparing, waiting, no longer had a place. He kept their numbers saved the same way, their old rooms in his memory unchanged, even as everything else moved forward. There were moments when he would sit and think about the past, not with regret, but with a kind of quiet reflection, wondering how much had changed and how much had simply revealed itself over time. Meanwhile, the lives of Ethan, Lucas, and Lily continued to move in a direction that made returning feel less immediate. Their environments demanded more of them, their responsibilities grew, and their identities became tied to a world that operated differently from the one they left behind. They adapted to expectations that valued independence, presentation, and success in ways that didn't always leave room for where they started. And as they built those lives, the connection to David became something they acknowledged, but no longer centered. The man who had once been the foundation of everything they knew became a smaller part of the story they were telling themselves. And yet, despite the distance, despite the years, despite the changes that had reshaped all of them in different ways, there was one thing David held onto without question. He believed they would come back, not just physically, but in a way that restored what time had stretched. He held onto the idea that when they returned, the space between them would close, that the years apart would make the reunion stronger, more meaningful. He didn't know exactly when it would happen, or what it would look like, but he carried that belief with him through every quiet morning and every long night, trusting that the story he had lived for them wasn't finished yet. The day finally arrived in a way that felt almost unreal, as if time had circled back to a moment David Carter had replayed in his mind more times than he could count. He woke up earlier than usual, not because he had to, but because sleep no longer held his attention the way anticipation did. Every small detail mattered to him that morning, from the way he pressed his shirt to the way he folded the sign he had made the night before, carefully written with the words "Welcome Home" in letters that weren't perfect, but were sincere. It wasn't just a sign, it was a message, a quiet expression of everything he had been holding onto for years. As he made his way to the airport, there was a steady tension beneath his calm, not fear, but something close to it, the kind of feeling that comes when a moment you've waited for begins to take shape in reality. Standing in the arrivals area, David positioned himself where he thought they would see him first, holding the sign firmly, even as his hands carried a slight tremor he couldn't fully control. Around him, people moved with purpose, reunions unfolding in different corners, laughter, tears, embraces that happened without hesitation. He watched those moments carefully, not out of distraction, but out of quiet observation, imagining how his own would feel when it finally happened. Every time the doors opened and new passengers stepped through, his attention sharpened, his posture straightened, his eyes searching through unfamiliar faces for the three that mattered more than anything else. Time stretched in a way that made each second feel longer than it was, anticipation building with every passing minute. And then, without warning, they appeared. At first, it was just a glimpse, three figures moving together with a confidence that stood out against the rest of the crowd. David recognized them immediately, not because they looked the same, but because something deeper, something instinctive, told him they were his. Ethan walked slightly ahead, his movements deliberate, his presence commanding in a way that suggested he had grown used to being seen. Lucas followed with a composed expression, steady and controlled, his awareness sharper, as if he was taking in everything around him without revealing much in return. Lily walked between them, her posture poised, her appearance refined in a way that reflected the life she had stepped into. Yet there was a brief moment, almost unnoticeable, where her eyes scanned the room with something that felt uncertain. David's face softened into a smile that carried years of waiting behind it. He stepped forward, lifting the sign slightly, not because they needed it to recognize him, but because it felt right, like completing something he had started long ago. In his mind, this was the moment where distance would collapse, where the years apart would dissolve into something simple and familiar. He expected movement, a reaction, something that matched what he had been holding onto all this time. But instead, what followed was quieter, slower, and far more difficult to understand. They saw him. There was no hesitation in their recognition, no confusion, no searching. Their eyes met his briefly, clearly, and yet their pace didn't change. As they approached, the space between them closed physically, but something else remained, something that couldn't be measured in steps or distance. David lowered the sign slightly, his smile still present, though now it carried a question beneath it. He spoke first, his voice warm, steady, reaching out in a way that had once been enough to bridge any gap. Ethan responded, but not with the familiarity David expected, his tone polite, controlled, the kind of response you offer when acknowledging someone you respect, but don't fully connect with. Lucas followed in the same way, his words measured, his expression neutral, as if he was navigating a situation that required care, but not emotion. Lily hesitated for a fraction of a second longer, her gaze lingering just enough to suggest something unspoken, before she, too, stepped into the same distance the others had already created. There was a pause, not long, but long enough to be felt, where the moment seemed to wait for something more, something that didn't come. The noise of the airport continued around them, announcements echoing, footsteps passing, conversations blending into a background that felt suddenly distant. David adjusted his grip on the sign, now lowered completely at his side, his posture shifting in a way that reflected something he hadn't yet fully processed. He searched their faces, not for recognition, but for something deeper, something that reminded him of who they had been. But what he found instead was composure, control, and a kind of separation that had taken root over time. Then came the moment that would define everything that followed. It didn't arrive with intention, it wasn't planned or dramatic. It came through a simple question from a stranger standing nearby, someone who had been watching the interaction with casual curiosity. The question was direct, harmless on the surface, asked without knowing the weight it would carry. "Are you their father?" For a brief second, the world seemed to narrow, the answer hanging in the space between them. David didn't speak, not because he didn't want to, but because something told him to wait, to let the moment unfold on its own. Ethan glanced at Lucas, a quick exchange that lasted no more than a second, but said more than words could. When Ethan finally responded, his voice remained calm, steady, unchanged from before, but the meaning behind it shifted everything. "Not exactly," he said, the words simple, almost casual, as if clarifying a minor detail rather than redefining a relationship. The stranger looked confused, waiting for more, and Ethan continued, filling the silence with an explanation that felt carefully chosen. "He helped us growing up, took care of things." The phrasing was deliberate, distant, removing something essential and replacing it with something else entirely. Lucas didn't correct him, didn't add to it, his silence acting as agreement. Lily's expression tightened slightly, but she said nothing, her gaze dropping for a moment before returning to the neutral composure she had maintained since they arrived. In that instant, the meaning settled in a way that didn't require repetition. David stood there, hearing the words, understanding them fully, even as part of him resisted what they implied. It wasn't loud, it wasn't confrontational, it didn't draw attention from the crowd around them, but it carried a weight that pressed down quietly, firmly, leaving no room for misunderstanding. The sign in his hand felt heavier than it had moments before, the words "Welcome home," now reflecting something that no longer matched the reality in front of him. He didn't interrupt, didn't question, didn't challenge what had been said. Instead, he remained still, his expression unchanged at first glance, but beneath it, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. For a moment, nothing moved, not in a way that mattered. The words had already been spoken, and there was no taking them back, no softening their meaning, no way to reshape what had just been placed between David Carter and the three people he had built his life around. He stood there, still holding the sign at his side, his fingers tightening slightly against the cardboard as if grounding himself in something physical while everything else shifted. He didn't raise his voice, didn't question them, didn't ask for an explanation that would only circle back to the same place. Instead, he did something far quieter, something that carried more weight than any argument could. He nodded. It was a small movement, almost unnoticeable to anyone who wasn't looking closely, but it held a kind of finality that words often fail to reach. That nod wasn't agreement, it wasn't acceptance in the way people might assume, it was recognition. Recognition of what had changed, of what had been lost, and of what could not be forced back into place simply because he wanted it to be different. David lowered the sign completely, his posture steady, his expression calm in a way that came not from peace, but from control. Years of holding himself together, of pushing through exhaustion and uncertainty, had taught him how to remain composed even when everything inside him was asking for something else. Ethan shifted slightly, as if expecting more, perhaps a reaction that would justify the distance he had created, something that would turn the moment into a conflict he could navigate. Lucas remained still, watching, his eyes sharper now, as if trying to understand something he hadn't fully considered before. Lily's composure faltered for a brief second, her gaze lingering on David in a way that suggested there was more beneath the surface. But whatever she felt, she kept it contained, following the unspoken direction the others had already set. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with everything that had not been said, every memory, every sacrifice, every moment that had led to this point. David adjusted his stance, not stepping closer, not creating distance, simply remaining where he was, grounded in a way that reflected a decision forming beneath the surface. He looked at each of them, not searching for validation, not waiting for correction, but seeing them clearly for who they were in that moment, not the children he remembered, not the versions of them he had held onto, but the people standing in front of him now. There was no anger in his expression, no visible disappointment, just a quiet understanding that settled in slowly, firmly. He realized that the years apart hadn't just changed their lives, they had changed the way those lives connected to his. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same steadiness it always had, but there was a difference, something subtle yet unmistakable. He didn't address what had been said, didn't repeat the words or challenge their meaning. Instead, he spoke in a way that closed the moment rather than extending it. He told them he was glad they made it back safely, that he hoped their journey had been smooth, the kind of words you offer out of habit, out of decency, not out of necessity. It wasn't a conversation, it was a conclusion. He wasn't asking for anything in return, not acknowledgement, not correction, not even understanding. The sign in his hand bent slightly as his grip loosened, the edges folding in on themselves as if reflecting the shift that had already taken place. He glanced at it briefly, then lowered his hand completely, no longer needing it, no longer holding onto what it represented. Around them, the airport continued as it always did, people reuniting, voices overlapping, life moving forward without pause. But for David, the moment had already settled into something permanent. He had come there expecting to reconnect, to step back into a role that had defined him for years, and instead, he found himself standing at the edge of something else entirely, something quieter, but no less real. And still, he didn't argue. He didn't beg. He didn't try to remind them of who he was or what he had done. Because in that moment, he understood something that didn't require explanation, that respect once lost in this way cannot be demanded back into existence. It has to be given freely or not at all. And as he stood there, facing the outcome of a life built on sacrifice, David Carter made a choice that would define everything that came next, not through words, but through what he chose to do after the silence. David Carter didn't stay long after that. There was no dramatic exit, no final speech meant to change minds or rewrite what had already been said. He simply gave one last look, not searching for something different, but acknowledging what was already clear, then turned and began to walk away. Each step felt measured, steady, as if he had already accepted the weight of the moment before it fully settled. Behind him, Ethan remained still, his expression unreadable, caught somewhere between certainty and something he hadn't expected to feel. Lucas watched more closely now, the calm control he carried beginning to crack under a realization that was forming too late. Lily took a small step forward, almost instinctively, her voice catching in a hesitation she couldn't quite overcome, but the moment passed before it could turn into action. David didn't look back, not because he didn't care, but because he understood that some moments lose their meaning the second you try to hold onto them longer than they were meant to last. As he moved through the airport, blending into the same crowd he had once stood apart from, there was a shift in him that wasn't visible from the outside, but was undeniable within. For years, his identity had been built around being their father, around the sacrifices he made and the future he believed he was shaping for them. But standing there, hearing the way they had redefined him, something inside him had changed. Not broken in the way people might expect, but clarified. He no longer needed to prove who he was, not to them, not to anyone. The ride home was quiet, not heavy with regret but filled with reflection. He thought about the years behind him, the choices, the effort, the moments that had shaped everything leading up to this point. There was no part of him that wished he had done less for them, no regret in the sacrifices he made, because those choices came from a place that didn't require validation. What changed wasn't the past, it was his understanding of the present. He realized that love, real love, doesn't guarantee recognition, and sacrifice doesn't ensure respect. Those things exist on their own, separate from the outcomes we expect them to create. Back in his apartment, the silence felt familiar again, but different this time, not as something to endure, but as something he could finally accept without waiting for it to change. He placed the folded sign on the table, the words still visible, though they no longer carried the same expectation they once did. For a moment he stood there looking at it, then let out a slow breath, not of defeat but of release. The years he spent holding everything together, pushing forward without question, had led him here, to a place where the truth was no longer hidden behind hope. And in that quiet realization, one thought remained, clear and steady, something that didn't need to be spoken out loud to hold its meaning. Respect isn't something you can buy, and love isn't something you can replace. The life he gave them was real, the sacrifices mattered, even if they were never acknowledged the way he once imagined. Because in the end, what defined David Carter wasn't what his children chose to call him. It was everything he had done when no one was watching, every moment he showed up when it would have been easier not to. And whether they recognized it or not, that truth didn't change. It never would. Stories like David Carter's don't end when the moment passes. They stay with you, long after the words have been spoken and the silence has settled. Because at its core, this isn't just about one man standing in an airport. It's about something deeper, something many people understand but rarely talk about. It's about what it means to give everything you have to the people you love, without knowing how they will remember you in the end. It's about the quiet sacrifices that never make headlines, the kind that happen behind closed doors in long nights and early mornings, in choices that don't come with guarantees. And maybe that's why this moment feels so heavy, because it forces a question that doesn't have an easy answer. What would you have done in his place? Would you have said something, tried to remind them of who you were, of everything you gave? Or would you have done exactly what David did, accepted the moment for what it was, and walked away without asking for anything in return? And then there's the question that lingers even longer, the one that doesn't fade as quickly. Would you forgive them or walk away? Forgiveness isn't simple in moments like this. It isn't just about letting go. It's about deciding what still matters when something fundamental has changed. Some would say a parent's love should endure no matter what, that time and distance can be repaired, that people can find their way back if given the chance. Others would see it differently, believing that respect, once lost in this way, creates a distance that can't be closed by words alone. There's no single right answer, no clear path that fits everyone, just a choice that each person has to make based on what they believe, what they value, and what they're willing to carry forward. And if you think this story was heartbreaking, wait until you hear what happened to the mother who made an even bigger sacrifice, a story where the cost of love went even further, and the outcome left even more questions behind.